The Ash family of Tomball, Texas, are pioneers, among the first to venture into territory that is as terrifying as it is promising. They are one of a handful of families who are already encountering the brave new world of human genetic engineering. It was not an encounter they expected or welcomed.
When they told me that my son had cystic fibrosis, fear went through me, and the helplessness of the situation, because I've always been one to beat the odds or try to change whatever, and this thing I had no, the doctors virtually told us there was no treatments and that we could do no cure and that we couldn't do anything about it. This is about God's perfect son, okay?
And Jesus,
and
yeah.
Jesus, yeah.
So he can see.
Paul is one of 30,000 children affected by cystic fibrosis in the United States today. While most can be kept alive into their teens and 20s, all eventually succumb, as did the Ash's niece, Farrell.
She was 9 years old and she weighed 49 pounds when she died. She was very, very frail. Her lungs were bad. I mean, she couldn't be without oxygen. I mean, if you just took it off her face to change it, I mean, it was like, give it back to me. You know, it was frightening. And then when your son is diagnosed with it, or your child, and you never think when you have a baby, you think things are going to be just pink and blue and puppy dog tails and everything's wonderful. And with our first child, everything was fine. And with Paul, you know, we found that things were not perfect.
The imperfection was in a gene that normally keeps the lining of the lungs moist. In cystic fibrosis, the lungs get clogged and repeatedly infected with potentially lethal diseases.
Now let's turn over and do your side. Just your side.
But because no one knew how the gene worked or how it goes wrong, there's never been a cure for cystic fibrosis.
There we go.
The Ashes provide Paul with as full a life as possible, but they knew that without some major breakthrough in research, they would one day lose him. And that's not the only loss they faced.
The other part of it is that I was so upset that I couldn't have any more children. And because we wanted a big family, and we wanted our kids to have each other, and if something happens to us or whatever, and life goes on, we want them to have each other. And that was the hardest part too.
Then came the event for which all cystic fibrosis families had been praying.
My sister had called me and said, Tessie, watch the 5 o'clock news.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, we'll watch the 5 o'clock news. So about that time, 4:30, Kevin comes home from work, and I meet him out in the driveway. This is 2 weeks after Paul had been diagnosed. And so I walked outside and I said, Kevin, he gets out of the truck and I said, you're just not gonna believe it. He says, what? You know, I said, they have discovered the gene. They have found the gene.
They've found the gene. We always seem to be hearing that nowadays. There's a real revolution underway in medicine. Finding the genes that underlie diseases means we might be able to predict and perhaps prevent diseases before they strike. And soon we might even be able to repair the genes themselves. The impact of this revolution is already being felt by families like the Ashes, now that the gene for cystic fibrosis has been found. The search for the gene had been long and hard, and when you see the size of the task, it's obvious why. Our bodies are made of billions of individual cells. At the heart of each cell is its nucleus, housing our genes as long strands of DNA at the core of our chromosomes. There are perhaps 100,000 genes in all, each gene a precise instruction, written out in the 4 letters of the genetic code, A, T, C, and G, the initials of the 4 different chemicals that form the rungs of DNA's double helix. It takes 6 billion letters of the genetic code to spell out the instructions to make a human being. If you wrote out those letters and stored them away, this is what you'd get. 23 pairs of drawers representing the 23 pairs of chromosomes you get from your parents, containing between them some 2 million sheets of paper. The gene for cystic fibrosis was finally located here on chromosome 7. A gene is typically a few hundred or a few thousand letters long. In people with cystic fibrosis, this particular gene has a tiny spelling mistake, most commonly a 3-letter gap right here. But you can have this defect and still be healthy, just a carrier. That's because in the chromosome you got from your other parent, you have a copy of the gene that's normal, and one good cystic fibrosis gene is all you need. As many as 1 in 30 people are carriers and don't know it. But if they have children together, there's a 1 in 4 chance their baby will have 2 defective genes. That's what happened when Tessie and Kevin Ash had Paul. And they faced the same 1 in 4 odds of a cystic fibrosis child if they conceived again. But then the Ashes got an extraordinary opportunity to beat those odds. To seize that opportunity meant taking a 5,000-mile trip from Texas to London. It was a trip Tessie began alone. But on this January morning, she was about to participate in an experiment that would, in effect, allow her to choose the genes of her new baby.
The problem, of course, is, though, that when you tamper with a human embryo, there is a theoretical risk that you might damage it, and yet it would be viable and it would go on to produce a baby that was in some way abnormal. Now, I'm not seriously suggesting to you that we're going to produce a baby that's missing an arm or a leg or something because we've moved the cell. But I think you have to realize it's an experimental technique.
Kevin has now joined Tessie as the experiment begins. It starts with what is today a routine procedure for couples trying to conceive through in vitro fertilization.
Going to another follicle.
After several days of hormone treatment to ripen as many of Tessie's eggs as possible, the eggs are removed with a fine needle.
We're on to 9 now.
Did you expect that many?
9 is a very good number.
Since Tessie is a carrier, each of Tessie's 9 eggs has a 50-50 chance of having the cystic fibrosis gene.
Yes, got the egg here.
So do each of the millions of Kevin's sperm. So depending on which sperm fertilizes which egg, the embryo that's created could have 2 CF genes, 2 normal genes, or 1 of each. Until just months before the experiment, there was no way to tell which genes each embryo got. But here today, an extraordinary diagnosis will be attempted. While still a microscopic speck of just 8 cells, each embryo, potentially the beginnings of a new person, will have its genetic code read and its destiny determined. In a surgical procedure involving instruments far finer than a human hair, 1 cell of each embryo is plucked off. The remaining 7 cells are potentially able to develop into a complete and normal baby. The test cell is then broken open and its genes released. In a gene amplifier, millions of copies of the gene are made, enough to allow its code to be read. Only 4 of Tessie's embryos have made it this far. The question to be answered, which, if any, are free of the CF gene? Being able to amplify genes means researchers can, in effect, peer into the DNA of each embryo. If 1 gene is affected, it will be a carrier. 2, and the embryo will have CF. And if neither is affected, it will be normal. As luck would have it, 2 of Tessie's embryos are completely free of the CF gene. These will be returned to her body. The others will be rejected.
I I feel comfortable with this because each cell does not know what it's going to be. It's not like there's a beating heart and it has a brain wave and at that point. So, you know, at this point, I feel more comfortable with it than I would at, you know, terminating a pregnancy.
The rest of the procedure is again routine for an in vitro fertilization.
Ow.
You can feel that.
Yeah.
But while this experiment in having disease-free children avoids the trauma of abortion, it doesn't guarantee success.
Well, the next step is wait and see, and probably in a couple of weeks they'll do a pregnancy test to see if it took. And then if it didn't, then it didn't, and if it did, then we may have one, we may have two. So we'll see.
As it turned out, Tessie didn't get pregnant. Not unusual for a woman having even conventional in vitro fertilization. But since she underwent her procedure, a handful of other women have conceived CF-free babies by the same technique, and Tessie herself plans to try again. The Ashes story gives a glimpse of the future that's being ushered in by the new era of gene hunting. As more and more genes are pinpointed within our genetic files, many more couples will have the opportunity to influence the outcome of conception's genetic lottery. But gene hunting doesn't only affect the next generation. You and I also have secrets hidden in our genetic files, genes that may predispose us to diseases like cancer or heart attacks. People have always been fascinated with devices that claim to foretell the future. Most of us don't take them seriously. We enjoy them because we know they can't really predict our fate. But the knowledge locked up in our genetic files is different. Knowing your genes predispose you to lung cancer, say, will certainly change your attitude to smoking. In theory, knowing your genetic fate should greatly improve preventative medicine. But what will it be like having all that knowledge? Who should share it? Your doctor? Probably. But what about your insurance company? Your employer? The government? And what about you? Will you want to know? What if, locked away in here,